Hello. How are we doing?
Hello.
Hey, that's okay. I'm okay. I'm okay starting with 2 minutes. I didn't have a link. That was the only thing. I was panicking slightly. Okay. How are you, Esa?
Everything good? Already alive. Some audience here.
Good. That's good. Do you want me to speak for like 10 minutes before, and then you ask me questions? Is that what we're doing?
I think we are doing pretty like that. 15, 20 minutes and we'll
I've got some remarks. I mean, I'm not actually.
Yeah. But I think we are ready to start then.
Yeah, I'm ready.
I allow me to a little bit introduce. It seems that we have already almost 20 people online. So we are welcoming everybody who are already present. So we welcome everybody to this morning webinar on future of EU advocacy after pandemic, and where we are discussing with the distinguished gentleman from Brussels, part of Europe, Mr. James Stevens, who is my colleague and managing partner in the Rud Pedersen Public Affairs Brussels office, and for those participants who are first time entering our talks. So my name is Esa Suominen, and I'm currently working as a chairman of the board and partner in Rud Pedersen Finnish office. And we are cooperating with James and the Brussels team in various customer cases and in energy field and in some other also Finnish industrial enterprises. So, but like as we know, it's been a strange couple of months or a year already in all lobbying and advocacy and influencing work. And what we were discussing with the team was that it would be very nice for the Finnish audience also to hear a little bit about how things are looking after now that you've been looking at this situation for a year, and what have we perhaps learned, and now that we are finally, hopefully, like starting to recover back to the normal. So what can we kind of, as an advocacy, public affairs consultancy professionals, what can you see? What has changed? What will kind of change back? Is there something which happened in the advocacy work in the lobbying arena, which you think that is something that will be here for time being? Is there something which kind of changed for good, like events like this, for example? Are we kind of will this stay on? And whatever kind of remarks you have on EU lobbying and EU advocacy, EU influence. So I think our Finnish audience will be very, very interested around those topics. And then I will also welcome any comments or questions from the audience. You can send them via the chat link. There's a chat window. Or you can ask ask yourselves and raise hand, or however this machine works. But we have our technical expert Hannu here also, like guiding us through the event. But without much further ado, so please welcome James Stevens, and floor is yours. And thank you for taking time to have a discussion with us.
Thanks, Esa. And I'd like to say that it's great to see the names of some of the people I recognise and we've met in the past in the attendees. It's great to speak to you again. I think probably my first visit when I joined Rud Pedersen to any office outside of Brussels was to Helsinki to visit Esa and the team. And I was buttering up Susanna, your new managing partner, up there the other day when she spoke to my team, saying how much out of all of the capitals in the Nordics that I enjoyed Helsinki the most, and it probably is the place that I visited the most. So you're on my list to come back to very quickly when we get a chance to travel. I love visiting your part of the world. So I thought it was an interesting question about how advocacy has changed or will change in the future, particularly in regards to how this pandemic and the way it's been handled has affected us. before I comment on that, just one comment on the Brussels marketplace, I suppose, which I look at from a consultancy perspective. But just talking to people around town, the Chamber of Commerce I'm part of as well, I actually think that I don't want to say it's boom time, but it's certainly, there's a huge amount of activity here. And I think if I look across certainly the industry that I'm part of, the consultancy industry in town, I don't, after an initial kind of shock, which I think the economy got generally right this time last year as we went into the pandemic, actually what's happened, I think, is there's been increased levels of activity as government has intervened in the economy in a big way. But also as Commission, in our case, has produced more and more quicker and quicker. So the government action is actually, for our business, has been very positive. And for many of our clients, they are more active than ever in Brussels rather than less active, which might not have been what we originally feared, I think, probably. So maybe our sector is one of those sectors that's done well out of the pandemic, bizarrely. The issue of change after pandemic and advocacy and how it's changing. I was reading actually probably this time last year, it was over the summer actually, I bought a book called How Not to Plan, and it's written by two planners from the advertising industry in the UK. And it's a really very good book, actually, full of real cool nuggets. It's one of those books which is a little bit of stories followed by kind of checklists and things to do, how not to plan, by two planners. And they come from advertising industry, kind of, had been in agency life in London for 20, 25 years. And they made the following kind of analysis about the advertising industry, about how it was full of 20 to 30-year-old people in London who were kind of, without cars, living in big urban centres and predicting that the world had changed. The world's changing, everything's changing, is the kind of message that 20 to 30-year-old advertising execs kind of give the world always. And their observation as people who are perhaps a little bit older and a little bit more experienced is everyone always says the world is changing at a huge pace, and actually many things just remain remarkably the same. So, their example was media consumption, that actually, the book's 2 or 3 years old. I guess it hasn't changed hugely in that time, but media consumption, TV watching for the vast majority of the UK population is still the main way they consume media. We all think about our Twitters and our Facebooks and all the social media channels that I know Esa uses, because he's been promoting me on one of them, at least, actually 2 of them this last week, much to the consternation of some of my friends back home. There's a tendency for us to live inside our bubble. And so I'm conscious when I then talk about EU advocacy that I suppose I'm a little bit like, it's not in the 20 to 30-year-old age range anymore, but I'm a little bit like those guys, is that someone who's relatively entrepreneurial and likes to, and has a fascination with shiny new things, that I want to tell you a story of how everything's changing and it's going to be so different in the future, right? Because that excites me and perhaps keeps me and Steph and other partners here kind of excited about the profession that we're in. But I think my message is going to be that most things are going to remain the same, as my first point. So, there's a lot of academic literature which is worth looking at, I suppose, about interest representation at an EU level. Some really very smart people looking at what we do from an academic perspective as we practice it. And I think a lot of that, will remain the same irrespective post pandemic. So, they talk about coalitions of interest, like one coalition of interest being bigger or better than the opposing coalition of interest. And they look at things like the socioeconomic weights of each of those coalitions of interest, alignment with public opinion. How far is the lobbyist case, the advocate's case, aligned with what is, I would say, perceived to be public opinion? Because last I checked, no one in this town really polls anyone ever. Maybe Eurobarometer once every 6 months, right? But most people don't do the kind of congressional polling that lobbyists might do in DC. But certainly the perception of alignment with public opinion is important, as expressed by media and others in your lobbying. And then advocacy skills, right? So they talk about those 3 areas generally. And then if you break down advocacy skills, which we can talk about, because I think that has changed certainly in the time that I've been in Brussels, and I think that continues to evolve, but reflects probably generally just the general trend of how we all communicate as individuals. Here we are on a webinar jam, right? And Esa was promoting me on Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms, which are of course available in the run-up to this. Advocacy skills are important. I always knock those down to public affairs, to 4 Ps and a C, which some of you have heard me talk about before. I think they're going to remain the same. So, for us, understanding the process, we are, there is a treaty, there are rules, and he who understands how those rules work and the process by which our particular sausage factory makes legislation is quite important. And that quite often gives you who's important within the process as well, and the timing of when you have to act. I don't see that changing particularly. So understanding process, I think, will remain the same. We have some changes predating pandemic, which is kind of a shortcutting of some of those processes, and the process being being shorter generally. Whether that's the use of trilogues, where we've gone from when I was in the Parliament 20 years ago, it was I think 5% had first reading agreements in 1999, 2004 legislature. We're now up to something like 80% of first reading agreements. That's changed the dynamics of how one advocates within the system, the changes to that process. But understanding process remains the same. Policy solutions, right? I mean, this is a consensus-based town, and trying to work out what you're trying to achieve from a business perspective provides a solution both to Europe and its goals, but also to the policymaker in terms of the policy solutions you bring is very, very important. So understanding that kind of where that kind of nexus between your interests and a good policy solution lies for the policymaker will remain important. The politics bit, the motivational aspect, and I think that's, talked in the past about this, I think this continues. Politics becomes increasingly important here, and you think that's strange, James, because it's all public affairs about politics. And I say, well, this town, yes, it's about politics, but it's about a certain kind of politics, institutional politics. So the cleavages between the 3 main institutions, actually the 4 main institutions, we might include the European Council in that, which is a separate body, of course. But also the cleavages between nations, right, between the member states, which is, that political cleavages are bigger, perhaps, than in any other national system than between the party political cleavages, although they've come more to the fore. But understanding those and what motivates those different actors within a political sense is important and will remain so. And perhaps has been the national part of that has always been at the forefront in an EU system, and probably again has been highlighted in the pandemic, given what we've seen about vaccines and travel and all those and recovery money and all that kind of stuff, right? And then people, relationships, right? So I always put the 4th P of people last, because my point is always it's about can you build relationships and maintain them rather than whether you have them. We have a relatively open system, and my advice to all those people, and I know some of the people's names on the side I see probably do interact with Brussels on a regular basis, it's not about the fact that I or any of my staff or indeed you have relationships, about have you got the nous understanding process, policy and politics to be able to build and maintain relationships. Okay, so any fool can get a meeting in this town, honestly. The question is, can you get something out of that meeting? Can you have a follow-up meeting? Can you keep the conversation going? Can you provide those solutions and help motivate the people within the system to take action? But you can get a meeting. Like anyone can. You can email today and get a meeting, right? And then my C is communications, right? So I'm a big believer that public affairs is just a communications discipline. We have an audience, we have a message, we have different channels. It sounds like communications to me, right? We're not trying to sell trainers to spotty 18 to 24-year-olds. But we are trying to sell ideas to policymakers and get them to change their beliefs or opinions through a variety of channels. 2 aspects there is channel selection. Has that changed? We'll come on to that. I don't think hugely it has, if I'm honest. Like which channels do we use to exert influence? And then secondly, the mix between the emotional and the factual. So this town, particularly because it's quite policy centric and policy heavy, tends to veer towards messages which are related to facts, and I quite often say industry fights on facts and loses on emotion in this town. We forget that right-hand, left-hand brain thing, right? We forget how people actually take decisions, and therefore we bombard them with facts and hope that wins the argument. So I think that's, so I think a lot of those kind of commentary and kind of how does Brussels work and how do you advocate within Brussels remains largely the same. But what has changed? Okay, so what has changed short term for me? My second point, what has changed? If I've said actually a lot of that just remains the same. So I think the observation I would have in speaking to others, clients, whether they be corporates or trade associations, clearly one of the things that's changed is is the thing that happens on the outskirts of the formal meetings, right? So if I would speak to some of my clients who actually go up to Helsinki, they go to Eka a lot, right? To sit around the rack and the SAYAC and all of that kind of stuff, which is one of the reasons I've been up to Helsinki in my past lives. The kind of off-the-record conversations that you have around the formal meeting. And my favorite thing is when I go and take a client to see someone in the parliament, actually, for me, the most important conversation and the way to frame that meeting is the walk with the assistant from the desk where they sign my client in to the MEP's office. That's the most important part of that bit, because that's going to settle what the MEP's thinking about today. You know, what's on their agenda. I'm going to ask all of those kind of questions. You know, I'm going to start with an open, hey, having a busy day, and then they're going to tell me everything that that's on their agenda of their boss today, right? And then I've already got an inroad, right? So those kind of bits. I mean, the Eka example, I had a client say to me the other day, yeah, we're just not getting the feeling from Eka that we normally get, you know, around those, the little thing, well, what do you reckon about this? You can't have those kind of conversations. So I'd say, you know, monitoring and intel is a key part, like knowing what's going on in order to inform action. The intel part of that is just a lot harder in a situation where we've been in a pandemic. But I think that's a short-term thing, clearly, right? So I think the moment we start going back to having physical meetings again, which I guess is probably really next year, not this year, but let's say normality, you know, kicks in next year, then I think that's solved. Some people said meetings themselves have been harder. So I've got I have a mixed view on that, actually. I think we've certainly not found that necessarily in most cases. So I think, like everyone, the institutional actors, particularly, for example, cabinets of commissioners, they suddenly find themselves doing exactly what we're all doing. They're stacking calls like every hour, right? We're off to the next call. So I feel, and I suppose I should be looking at data to support that, but I feel we've done as much, if not more, high level political level outreach in the last 12 months than we did in previous 12 months, and certainly I've been doing this for 20 years, so I kind of look at that and say, does it feel different? Actually, if anything, I think it feels like more. Now, that might be about the pandemic in terms of the availability, but also might be about the number of issues that's on the agenda as well. Like, they're under a lot of pressure to do a lot of things at the moment. There have been some pockets of resistance to that, or some maybe exceptions from my perspective, maybe not if we look at we had data overall, and that's assistants for MEPs, right, who normally might be in the parliament at their desks. You know, if you haven't already got that relationship, then clearly forming that relationship might be harder at the moment. But again, does that remain the case post-pandemic? I don't think so. I think that's a kind of temporary piece, right? What it has done, so the third one of that, then I actually want the reflection about what might change. What also may have happened, and Stefan, who's my partner, wrote a nice blog piece about this. He says something like, just because we're all using Zoom, in this case webinar, John, doesn't make us digital. Okay, so his point of view, and he has a bit of a moan about this, because he was one of the guys that kind of introduced the concept of introducing integrating digital communications into public affairs probably 10, 12, 13 years ago in this town, is that he feels a little bit like, because our traditional public affairs practitioner, who is used in this town, if we're honest, to having meetings because they're relatively easy to have, kind of discounts other channels. Like quite often we confuse access with influence, right? So we say, well, I had a meeting, right? So, and so we try to spend a lot of time talking about how influence works and how you might get messages to other people in different ways, including using digital tools in embedding them in what we do. His point of view is very clearly that there's a Zoom, that the idea we've all gone digital because we're using Zoom to have meetings, is kind of makes it easy for the public affairs practitioner to tick the digital box and say, well, I'm digital, right? And there might also be a headspace issue, right? So particularly for those who are slightly older and maybe not used to the kind of evolution of the way technology is changing all facets of life, you know, maybe they can only cope with figuring out how to set up a Zoom call rather than starting to do some of the other really interesting things, which are, you know, the use of digital platforms to manage monitoring and intelligence, right? There's all sorts of other ways in which that might embed itself. Digital tools might embed themselves in how we practice public affairs in this town. So I think there, but maybe that's just a short-term piece, right? Maybe the trajectory which I think we are seeing, we went from we must have a website because the MEPs Google us before we go to meet them. We're now saying everyone in this town uses Twitter and LinkedIn, as far as I can tell, to try and push out messages to people in this town. It seems to be happening. Google AdWords, and I've been using Google AdWords 2008, 2009 for some of our clients here. We're all trying to use those methods. And then the third step is, do we embed more of the kind of digital tools to actually help us do the actual public affairs lobbying? Do we make ourselves more efficient rather than just use tools as communication channels? It's like the kind of digitalization of public affairs rather than the use of digital communications tools for outbound communication. I think that trend will continue. I think we've had a blip, is what Stefan has, as everyone has kind of pivoted to. I'm using Zoom, so I'm to digital. So what might continue? So those are kind of blips, right? So most things are going to stay the same. There's some things that have changed short term, but I think are going to go back. And my third bit is, well, what might continue to, what changes might this pandemic have created that will continue post pandemic? So I have three things there. So the first thing is a little bit of and I think the reason it might continue is because it's a desired thing for the policymakers in Brussels. And that's actually things like this. So I think one thing we've definitely seen and we've experienced with our clients is the desire of all of the institutions to be part of platforms we've created, having conversations with our clients, particularly where we bring people from outside of Brussels. So my point is, actually the pandemic has shown that you don't need a Cisco bloody great big sweet functionality. And now we're all au fait with it. It's like second nature to us. And I think from a policymaker standpoint, they looked at this and said, look, we're now boxed down. We're all in our homes too. We need to understand what's going on. And we did a series for the metals industry with MEPs, probably April, May time last year. And we had MEPs on the panel. We got CEOs of of companies based out in Europe, and the audience was pan-European. So I think it's just like kind of lowered the barrier to entry for people outside of Brussels to engage with Brussels. But also it's shown to policymakers that there are ways of doing this that they can engage with outside of Brussels. And I think for me, given the incentive is still in this town for Brussels to show that it is connected and it is listening outside of the Brussels-based lobbyist, I think for you guys sat in Finland, that this is great opportunity time. And I think the institutions, it may not all be online events like this, but I think it's shown that there is a benefit from potentially doing more hybrid kind of events, right? Where people can be on screen and doing it in the way that we do news broadcasts, right? I mean, I'm British of origin, right? So I'm soon to be Belgian and Italian, but we have Newsnight and they're always doing, right? They have the guy down the line and they have the guy in the studio, and it works perfectly fine. And I think we'll see more of that kind of thing, to be honest. Certainly something that we're starting to experiment with, and we'll be ready for when we start having physical events to do more hybrid. And I think that's in the interest of the institutions, and that's why I think it will continue. And I think for you guys, it's really interesting because I think it lowers the barrier to entry. You don't have to get on a plane to Brussels, although we'd be happy to see all of you here. Maybe not all at the same time, but, happy to come. The second thing I'd say is the nature of Brussels. I think what we've seen, particularly with the recovery fund, and I think this is one thing I remarked upon when I spent a very dangerously short amount of time working in Washington, D.C., is what struck me there is you sat on the metro. I used to get the metro in from, for those of you who've been to Washington, I used to live out in North Bethesda, I think it's called, but it's actually Rockville, Maryland. I used to come in on the metro, on the Washington metro system, and you'd see advertisements on the metro about the latest Joint Strike Fighter replacement jet engine, right? You'd listen to the local Maryland radio, and it'd be advertising the alternative to the C-130. There was a lot of what I call B2G PR, right? So federal government as customer, how do we position ourselves, looking at money as much as looking at policy. Now, okay, we're never going to have the kind of money that the federal government of the United States has, and probably not even the kind of budgets that national government has. But clearly there has been a change with the recovery fund, and we certainly felt that here, is that the recovery fund issue has taken funding opportunities from an EU level to a kind of niche area of research funding, which was exceptionally hard to tap, if we're honest. You probably had to have partners in several universities, several member states. And we've seen more appetite, and I've had more companies come to me about how do we position ourselves in a way to get access to EU funds combined with national funds that I have done in the last 20 years, in the last 12 months. So I think that change, might be an interesting one, okay? The move to B2G. And I think alongside that, and that's again, I think an interesting one, it's perhaps not because of pandemic, but I see the other trend about the B2G, but also the B2B. So I think there's an increasing understanding, and this is aside from pandemic learning, that Brussels is a good place to come if you're in a B2B environment to build different kinds of relationships with your customer base. Clearly not a B2C, but certainly a B2B environment, because everyone's here. And certainly we've collaborated with some of our other parts of our company with some of the Nordic players to do that quite successfully recently. I think then the other piece, the last piece I talk about is speed of action. I talked about the politics of it and the EU being increasingly important, public opinion being increasingly important in this town, or at least the perception of it, I think, has risen. Clearly, we've seen heavy criticism of the Commission for not getting it right on vaccines. I think there's some good reasons why they didn't get it right, but some bad decision making. And I think what we've also seen is that the reaction of the EU has been to do more rather than do less. And we've seen lots more pushing for things being done quickly. And I think that poses some increasing challenges for advocates in this town, both the politicization plus the speed aspect of it. I think we've been very much used to long-term, green paper, white paper communication, like things that take a long time to build. And now we're getting much more, which you guys are going to be much more familiar with from a kind of national level, like political declaration from the government, and then something happens, right? I mean, we're getting much more like that, and I think that might change over time the way in which we have to advocate here. Probably also makes it a little bit more public campaigning, public opinion mattering more. Certainly for our clients, we're seeing a lot more activity where some of those trends that we've talked about for a long time, the relevance of media, the relevance of the online space, public opinion, we're doing a hell of a lot more kind of market research work about public opinion in member states around issues that are EU issues, message testing. It's becoming that kind of more sophisticated, kind of broader American sense of public affairs, I think we are seeing that. And I think the way that the political system is changing, because I think public affairs reflects the political system that you operate in. That's why American public affairs are very different from Brussels, and Brussels is very different from Helsinki, I'm guessing. I think that is changing. Our political system is changing. I expect public affairs, and I think the COVID crisis has just reinforced some of those trends around politicization, about the speed of action from an EU level, about the importance of public opinion, all of those kind of things. And I think we can see that continue, and that's going to change the kind of things that we do here. Esa, to you, sir.
Thank you, James. These were very, very, I took a lot of notes. Gonna sell these as my own ideas. Later in Helsinki. Yeah, thanks. This was very, very good remarks, and I have a couple of ideas myself. But like Sofia Leinonen already raised in the chat, like how do you see, like, is the EU transparency register now like up to date in this sort of new times, or will that develop in some way after?
We've got like 2 now. Why? Not because we don't need to go to the Parliament at the moment, and we didn't, in the midst of doing everything else, no one's re-registered. I looked at everyone else's registries, and it's the same for most of organisations. They've just not got down to re-registering. I need a mental note. I need to tell my team to do that now, because in 6 months' time, everyone will be queuing up at the Parliament trying to get their pass renewed. Right. So I think, other than that, aside, I think the direction of travel on transparency is clear. I think, there have been some changes. I've actually lost track about whether they've just adopted those. They finally adopted the changes that they were talking about making in the institutional agreement between the 3 institutions. I should check that for us. But the direction of travel is clear. I think we're heading towards a mandatory system at some point. So at the moment, it's quasi-mandatory, or it's mandatory, de facto mandatory, because if you're not registered, then you can't have meetings with senior people in the commission. So it's de facto mandatory, and I think it is a social license to operate issue, both for us as consultants, but for all corporates. I don't think we have anything to gain by not being transparent. I would probably say that I think some of the ways that they look at money makes no sense. But certainly our industry, and we're a member of the European Public Affairs Consultants Association, advocates for it to become mandatory and for a level playing field for all in terms of consultancy and competitors, which would apply to corporates as well if it's mandatory. So we want to put it on a legal footing. So evolution over time, I think where this goes, and you've already seen that in some member states, there's a project actually for a client last year about this. I think member states will necessarily follow. So one of the big debates here has been how far should it apply to council? So it's okay applying to council secretariat, but council secretariat, actually is probably the least visited part of the EU institutions. People forget about it. It's the perm reps, of course, which are national civil servants, right, who are here in the representations in Brussels. How far does it apply to them? I think eventually it will, if I'm honest. And then the question becomes, how far does it apply to, say, Sophie, maybe you're meeting, I don't know, the Ministry of Environment in I don't know where Sophie's from, but in Helsinki, about the revision of the Ross directive, which is something I've done in the last few years, been up to Helsinki to do that. How far should that meeting be registered in Brussels? Because in effect, you're lobbying a member of the legislature at an EU level on an EU issue. But how about if you meet with that same person, you talk about the implementation of the current Ross directive, which is a national issue, but then in the second half of the meeting, you talk about the evolution of the Ross directive, which is on the review here, but won't happen anytime soon because the Pellegrini unit at DG Environment is overwhelmed with different things. So I think there's a question there. I think they're national debates. I mean, we're seeing that in the UK at the moment, right? You've seen the Green Seal issue. I don't know if people are following David Cameron and his activity. My observation is former politicians are normally the worst people in the world when it comes to understanding the barriers of what is legitimate behaviour. So I think you'll see that in national markets. The people who've taken it to the most extreme, if you want to see how extreme it can get, is the Irish. Actually, if you meet with an Irish MEP here, you are supposed to register it in Dublin under Irish law. Because they are an elected, Irish official. Or certainly if you meet with a perm rep, we would supposedly have to register it in Dublin in the Irish register because we met with a government official of the Irish. So I think you're going to see more and more of those kind of things. I think it's incumbent upon on public affairs practitioners in member states to do the right thing and get ahead of the curve. So I would encourage people to think about forming their own public affairs associations, professional codes of conduct, and doing all of those kind of things. I think we have nothing to hide. I know for Nordics that's sometimes a weird question because you have trust-based societies, and therefore maybe it's more of an Anglo-Saxon thing where we don't have quite as much trust in people. But I think it's coming is my answer. And so I think as an industry we have an interest in getting ahead of that.
Yeah, this is something which is also very, much on time here because in Finland you don't have any kind of legislation around the issue. And now there is a government proposal around a regulation, and EU will definitely be one place where you kind of look for inspiration. And basically the question only being that how do you kind of set the bar in a way that it doesn't bring this sort of mental obstacle for a normal person to reach out to a public official or a public. And
I think that's for me, that's the beauty still of the EU system, which I mentioned, is access is not an issue, to be honest. I mean, the former member state I know best, when I'd have people come over from London and I'd show them the Commission's phone book. The Commission's phone book is on their website. I can find you the name of any of commission official and their direct line within about 2 minutes, right? And a quick phone call will establish who's working on that particular piece of legislation. And if we've got something interesting to say, they'll likely meet us. And they were astonished by that, absolutely astonished. So, yeah, I agree. Yes, I think it's, I think the bit that I think you have to be wary of is everything to do with the financial declarations. So I think that the bit that, so we're in a incredibly open system. And I think and that's what the beauty of this place is and why I think it is a great example of how a system can work and deliver decent policy outcomes for the people it's supposed to represent. It's not by any means perfect, but I think as a system it works pretty well. But the money aspect of it is kind of transposed from the American system, right? So the fears about the role of money in politics. I mean, let's be honest, no one here in Brussels has any damn money. Like, talk to a consultant, right, who's got clients. Like, there's no real big money in this town compared to the US. Look at the transparency register spending of some big corporates in Brussels and then compare it to how much they spend in Washington, DC on the OpenSecrets.org platform. It's ridiculous. Even companies whose regulation globally is driven by this place. If anyone's not read my friend Anu Bradford, her book, The Brussels Effect, she's a great academic from Columbia Law School, talks about this place being the kind of regulatory empire, right, and talks about how Brussels standards pass around the world. Have a read of that. Invited to speak to your corporate board. You'll get a lot out of it. She's an amazing speaker. I look at some consumer goods companies, for example, where I know that consumer goods regulation globally is set here, right? Chemical ingredient stuff, that kind of stuff that I work on a lot. And I look at how much they spend in Washington and how much they spend here, and it's no comparison. But that money in politics thing comes over to Brussels. And so I think if I was advising people at a national level about how to deal with it, I'd kind of have a good grasp of that aspect of it, because I think it pollutes the debate. So I think, how do you report that? Do you need to report that? Does it make sense? I'll be having sensible, grown-up conversations with the policymakers who want to regulate lobbying about what works and what doesn't. And then I'd also be talking about some other really bad examples, which are, for example, the Canadians. I remember years ago a Canadian colleague telling me every time anyone rings a ministry official in Ottawa, the ministry official has to file a report to their superior about what the conversation was about. So you imagine what happens. The conversation just doesn't. No one rings the ministry official during the working hours. They talk to them over the weekend at the barbecue. So what did you achieve by that, right? As you say, you just achieved that normal citizens, normal people can't have access to government officials. Yeah. Right? It's a self-defeat. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks. Very good. Tina Rytilä is asking, like my former colleague from our joint government times, he's asking that Brussels is a consensus-based town, but we still strong characters in the Commission, Mr. Timmermans, for example. Yeah. Is this like now with your 20 years of experience, how would you comment? Like, is it less collectively organized?
I'll be honest, for many of our clients, and I think for this town as a whole, I think Mr. Timmermans in particular has come as a bit of a shock to us. So I think, for the, and I mean, you example, Marco Menzik at Cefic. I don't know if there's anyone on the line that's part of the broader chemical industry. Marco Menzik done a fantastic job at Cefic, which is the Chemical Industry Association. It's one of the biggest, most well-funded, lobby groups in town, representing the chemical sector. Huge, great new building on Rue Belliard. He's done a fantastic job in many ways of reshaping the image of the chemical sector in this town, all of those kind of things. Look at his press release when they put out the chemical strategy. So all of the work he'd done mattered not one iota. And if you read the chemical strategy for sustainability that came out late last year, which sets out what they're going to do to chemicals regulation in the next 10 years, you'll find it's basically a cut and paste job of all of the fears that were expressed in a white paper from 2001. Nothing changed, despite REACH, despite the world's biggest, most complicated chemical legislation, despite all of that. And the answer why was it was driven by one lady in the cabinet of Timmermans, who rode roughshod over everyone else. DG Grow didn't even get a look at, by all accounts, the enterprise people, the industry people. So I think the politics, and I think, so even Marco, who I think is a super representative of his industry and done an amazing job and really is a political player, in a way that very few are, I think, in this town, has not managed to curb the kind of the thought process and the political thought process of Timmermans. And I think what you're also seeing is, to be honest, no one within the Commission stands up to him. So, you know, the others are very weak. So Peter, who works with us as a former head of cabinet for Connie Hedegaard, you know, we were talking the other day about, you know, the dynamics of the college and how it debates issues at a political level. And he made the same observations you make about any meeting, right? Like there's anchoring bias. There's most of the room doesn't speak, right? So, and you look around that table and you look at the other commissioners, you say, well, who's got the weight to want to stand up and take on a Timmermans on some of these issues? So, you know, it does happen, but people have, I mean, actually, there has been an example in recent days that I've heard of, which we've been involved with one of our major clients, where we've got what we want on a piece of implementing guidelines, not legislation, but the legislation itself, which is the Single-Use Plastics Directive, is the worst piece of legislation ever written. We're going to spend the next 10 years trying to fix all the disaster that they came up with when they rushed through in 6 months a piece of legislation that was completely ill thought out. And under any previous commission, actually it was in the last commission, but it's still Timmermans in charge. Under any, you know, in the last 20 years, that piece of legislation would have been 5 years in the making. They did it in the space of, 3 months to come up with it and then 6 months to adopt it. And we're going to spend the next 10 years trying to, most of it you can't implement. Like into the packaging industry saying we can't actually physically do that. So I think there's a lot of that. And the question is who in the college is going to stand up to that, and whether industries in this town who traditionally have worked through this long-term policy process can then motivate themselves. And that's where national comes in, right? So we want to get the Finnish commissioner jumping in and down. We need Finnish industry to be knocking on his door saying, hey, there's this thing in Brussels that you guys need to stand up and do something about, right?
I noticed that there is several people from Finnish forestry industry here, like actually present.
They'll be happy about the thing that I'm talking about. I'm not mentioning what it is.
But I can think this is one of the key messages to this audience. I have one question, but before we go to that, so Niklas Backlund is asking whether you see change in terms of like significance between EU institutions now, like, you know, is something becoming more important now as before? Like, okay, we talk about speed being now this sort of a new thing that like processes which took years to go through. So now they are much more faster. Does this mean that, like, is this something where like Commission naturally always has been the number one player, but is it becoming even more?
So I think the observation, even since Barroso, would be that the Commission's political importance has been diminished. And I think, for me, the big sign of that was when the Nice Treaty, when the European Council became an institution. Because up until then, it wasn't an institution; it was a meeting. And I think there you got, you know, post Nice, you got member states. And it's a fundamental travesty about the UK leaving, right? Everything that happened after the enlargement to the east was about large member states retaking power and influence within the system. So I think, if anything, Nicholas, over years, what you've seen is member states, particularly large member states, reasserting themselves. European Council as a directional body for policy. It's supposed to be about, remember, it's supposed to be about strategic direction of the EU, right? It was supposed to be, you know, Fontainebleau summits and where do we go from here and Euro and all that kind of stuff, like the big stuff. It now pronounces on all sorts of things, right? And then that's what sets the direction for the Commission and what the Commission does in policy terms, in a way that I think the Commission was more self-starting in the past. I mean, we had a kind of bubbling up kind of system, right, within the Commission, with lots of different people coming up with ideas. And now we've probably got a bit more directional stuff, mainly from member states. So I think, if anything, over time, what's happened is member states, who always were important, right, as a club of member states, have regained some from the Commission. The Commission, to a large extent, you know, has become emasculated. Perhaps arguably, we talked about Timmermans, perhaps arguably recently that political drive has been reinfused in certain areas. I think Parliament, you know, clearly has matured. I mean, even in the time I've been here, but if you look at it as a co-legislator, it has matured. But I would say one of the big changes, I mentioned it earlier, in the last 20 years has been the move from doing 2 readings under the treaty to doing first reading agreements. And for my money, at least, that's reduced the power of Parliament rather than increased it in the name of efficiency and speed. I had a good friend actually worked for 15 years for UK government here, is now back in Wales, and he did a talk actually and spent all of that time either in the UK as part of council coming over or here as part of council. And he was reflecting on that change over time in trialogues. And he said there's kind of been a betting game going on where the Parliament started taking it to plenary to have the full force of the Parliament behind it. And then the council, in order to match the Parliament, took it to council to get political agreements before they negotiate, so they could say they had the full force of the council behind them. And actually then what happened, of course, is the council, once it's got political agreement, in order to change its negotiating position, has to go back to the council, right, rather than at working group level, which means there's a lot less flexibility on the council side to move its position. So if you combine that with the fact that under the old conciliation process, the third reading that we used, when I remember my boss back in 2001, stayed up to 4 o'clock in the morning under the Danish presidency to amend the cosmetics directive, right, in a meeting room with the Danish presidency and the commission. That just doesn't happen anymore at all. Like, you're lucky if it's like 1 or 2 dossiers that go to conciliation. There, the Parliament had huge power, and if you look at the Parliament does a really interesting report at the beginning of every legislature about the previous legislature. And if you look at those reports for the last 4 cycles, you see the number going down of the second and third readings, and the number of what first readings going up. And you note that actually historically, if something got to the conciliation committee and the Parliament was behind it, it meant it had the full force of an absolute majority of its members behind it. And in like 80-90% of the cases, those amendments would go through and end up in legislation. It weeded out all the stuff that didn't have consensus in the Parliament, and you ended up with the stuff that did. And so I think the Parliament's lost some of its clout there as an institution, although it might mean that certain individuals have increased that power, right? If you're an influential member and you're the one that gets the dossier and you're the one negotiating, there's all of that kind of stuff, which makes it harder for us, if we're honest, right? The more time we have, the more stakeholders we involve, the likelihood is that from an outside perspective, with more opportunities for influence, the smaller the number of people, the shorter the time, the more behind closed doors, you get to a situation where, unless you're best mates with Harry Reid, you can't influence what happens on the Senate floor.
Very good. My question would be about this, like you mentioned the recovery fund as this one sort of a new initiative which has sort of electrified the atmosphere a little bit and bringing more interest. This is something where, like here in the small Nordic countries, like the national debate is about that, okay, we're paying in 8 and we're getting back 3 billion euro. So what's the catch here? Like this, okay, of course we understand that we're getting this in advance, and the European recoveries, benefits our export markets, etc., etc. But this is like this sort of a popular talk of town. Then there is this more theoretic criticism around that. Okay, is this something which is sort of which we see after since the future convention failed, like back in the old age, which is Kurdistan and that process there. So after that, this sort of open advancing of this sort of European joint ventures has been more, being done that, okay, now there's a crisis and we put something together and up, and then this goes a little bit against.
We had everything to do with sovereign debt crisis and so forth, and we had migration crises and all of those crises that we've had over the last 10, 15 years. And the answer was tried to be for member states to solve it outside of the EU system, like by creating new treaties. Remember the Cameron thing, he didn't want to be part of bailing out the Eurozone and all that kind of stuff. Actually, what we've seen in this crisis is, Commission taking power, taking member states actively saying, Commission, you can take on the vaccine stuff, right? Putting it under the Commission. We've seen the recovery funding and everything to do with European recovery, the Commission taking a lead and using new instruments that we could only dream. And I imagine like 2 years ago, someone proposing that the Commission would do what it's just done in terms of how it raises money and then spends it. I think you look at them and say, God, you're like completely bonkers. So I think you're right to say, Esa, that crises generally do result in the EU in some way going forward in integration. I think what's interesting for me, at least, is that there is maybe a point where the Commission has taken on a new role. Whether they got it right or not is interesting. I was interesting. I have a big debate clearly with my friends back home in the UK about, who all pro-Remain actually, but now they've left. They want to point out how it's great to be outside, right?
Of course,
on a regular basis. Yeah. And clearly the vaccine stuff is where they jump up and down, until I point out the deaths per capita, which along with Belgium are horrendous in the UK, right? But we were talking about the disaster which has been vaccine procurement, and kind of my observation is I think we'll probably get, the lessons that will be taken from that by the Commission are probably more integration is needed rather than less. And then I noted a communication end of last year, which I'd missed, where they talked about creating a new authority to do exactly just that. So, to kind of embed what has become an ad hoc thing in a crisis into a long-term thing that will clearly evolve over time. Remember how we do things, guys. We take little bits and we nibble away, and it's creep, right? It's not bang stuff, it's creep.
Yeah, this is interesting in this, that whether this will be...
And then we codify later in a treaty, right? Then, 5 years, 10 years down the line. I'm not sure anyone with a right mind is going to be opening up any treaties anytime soon. But I think we're nibbling away is my answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe I'll go back on my thinking of earlier that the Commission as I speak.
Yeah, this is sort of like whether, because this is basically the debate is that like whether this will be as said a one-stop shop. That okay, this is this once used tool, and then we get back to normal, or is this something which will be codified and be here forever with us?
So I think there's another thing about the recovery funding and everything about that. One is, as that was all happening, I honestly rang my friend up who was a cabinet official for a commissioner responsible for this kind of area in the last commission, and I said to him, let's look at. To be honest, I've never really paid attention to the budget, because most of the budget gets spent on cap and structural funds. Like my clients generally don't have that much interest in any of that. It's not a lot of money. What is it, like 1% of GDP, right? So generally we've not paid a huge amount in any normal government. You'd be paying a huge amount of interest, right, to what the budget says, because it tells you what government's real priorities are. Here we never really tendered. I mean, a kind of EU geeky level, the big contours of McSharry reforms and stuff, but not, and the fights between member states. We're all kind of interested from a personal perspective, but from a day-to-day business perspective, from what we do, it's never been front and centre. And so I ring this guy up and say, look, budget, like, God, I just got to get my head around this, because like everyone's asking, like, can you help me? And he said, well, kind of, I eventually got my head around it, but it's really hard. And to be honest, there's only about 4 people in the Commission that really understand it, because it's been, is not being the kind of lingua franca of the Brussels stakeholder environment. So I think on the Brussels stakeholder side, there's a lot of catching up to do on that. But equally, I think on the institutional side, I think the Commission looked at that, to be honest, when we're talking about, at one stage they were talking, for example, we work in renovation. I think the Timmermans cabinet leaked, or someone leaked, a draft document from the Timmermans cab, which was how they were going to set up funds which were managed centrally by the Commission on renovation. And my guys, we were cock-a-hoop. We were like, this brilliant stuff, right? And apparently one of the reasons they walked back from that was they realised that within the Commission, they didn't have the administrative capacity to manage something like that. They had absolutely no experience of managing that scale of programme, that scale of money. So I think, we might see that it's a little bit, petty pack kind of strategy until they can build that stuff up. But they backed away from that and said, we're not competent, actually, to do that. We're not a national government. We don't have that kind of competence. And let's just remember, like, how many Commission officials are there? 24,000, and a third of them do translation.
Yeah. It's not very big.
No.
But yeah, I think that we are almost on time, and we are getting thanks in the chat box. Thank you, James, for your time,
guys.
And I always learn a lot of these, and hope to see you live soon. And I
hope to be up there with you.
Yeah, let's have a round of beer as soon as possible.
Beer with you, Esa, is always great fun.
Yeah, thanks a lot, James, and thanks for the audience and active comments.